Ever heard of the man who built the FBI and blackmailed America? The man who kept secret files on senators, presidents, celebrities, civil rights leaders, gangsters, and almost anyone powerful enough to matter. For nearly 50 years, politicians, presidents, and entire generations came and went. But one man remained. His name was J. Edgar Hoover. He transformed the FBI into one of the most powerful law enforcement organizations in the world. And according to many of his critics, he stayed in power because he knew everyone's secrets. Some called him a patriot. Others called him a tyrant. Some believed he protected America. Others believed he was quietly controlling it. Either way, he became one of the most feared men in American history. This is the story of J. Edgar Hoover, the man who knew too much. Washington, D.C. Late evening. A senator sits alone in his office. The building is quiet. Most of the staff have already gone home. Then the phone rings. The conversation is brief, polite, professional. Nothing that could be called a threat. Nothing illegal. Nothing explicit. Yet by the time the senator hangs up, he feels uneasy. Because the caller works for J. Edgar Hoover. And everyone in Washington understands the same unwritten rule. The director of the FBI knows things. What exactly he knows is often unclear. But that uncertainty is part of the power. The senator leans back in his chair. The phone call is over. But the message remains. Some secrets never need to be revealed. People only need to believe they exist. And few people understood that better than J. Edgar Hoover. Chapter 1. The Boy Who Loved Order. Long before J. Edgar Hoover became one of the most powerful men in America, he was simply a boy growing up in Washington, D.C. At first glance, there was nothing extraordinary about him. He wasn't born into great wealth. He wasn't a military prodigy. He wasn't a political superstar. No one looked at young Hoover and predicted that he would one day influence presidents, shape national policy, or build an institution that would outlive him by generations. But there were signs. Small signs. The kind that only become obvious in hindsight. From an early age, Hoover loved order. Rules. Discipline. Structure. The world made sense when everything was organized. Everything in its proper place. Everything properly recorded. Properly categorized. Properly controlled. It was a mindset that would define the rest of his life. Because Hoover grew up during a period of enormous change. America was expanding. Cities were growing. Immigration was increasing. New technologies were transforming society. The country felt bigger, faster, more complicated. And for many people, change creates uncertainty. Hoover hated uncertainty. He preferred systems. Systems could be managed. Systems could be monitored. Systems could be controlled. As a student, he developed a reputation for discipline and determination. He worked hard, paid attention to details, and excelled in environments that rewarded organization. While others focused on grand ambitions, Hoover focused on efficiency. While others dreamed about power, Hoover learned something even more important: how institutions work. Because institutions don't depend on charisma. They don't depend on popularity. They don't depend on public approval. Institutions endure. And the people who understand them often wield more influence than anyone realizes. After studying law, Hoover entered government service at a young age. The timing could not have been better. Or perhaps more dangerous. Because America was entering one of its most anxious periods. Revolution had erupted in Russia. Political extremism was spreading across Europe. Bombings and violent attacks were making headlines. Many Americans feared that radical movements might spread into the United States. Fear was everywhere. And fear creates opportunities. Especially for ambitious young officials. Hoover quickly found himself working with information. Lists. Records. Names. Files. Thousands of them. Most people saw paperwork. Hoover saw something else: patterns, connections, intelligence, control. The ability to know who people were, what they believed, who they associated with, where they fit within a larger system. It fascinated him. And the deeper he went, the more convinced he became of a simple idea. Information is power. Not money. Not popularity. Not even political office. Information. Because if you know enough about people, you can often predict them, influence them, sometimes even control them. It was a lesson Hoover would never forget. And over the coming decades, he would build an entire empire around it. An empire made not of soldiers, not of territory, not of wealth, but of files, records, and secrets. Lots of secrets. Most people spend their careers chasing power. J. Edgar Hoover was chasing information. The difference may sound small. It wasn't. Because information has a unique advantage. It can be collected quietly, stored quietly, and used quietly. And as America entered a period of growing fear and political unrest, a young Hoover was about to discover just how valuable that could be. Chapter 2. The Red Scare. In 1917, the world changed. The Russian Revolution shocked governments across the globe. A centuries-old monarchy collapsed. Revolutionaries seized power. And for the first time, a communist government emerged on the world stage. To many Americans, the event felt distant. To others, it felt like a warning. What if revolution spread? What if radical movements gained support inside the United States? What if America was next? Fear began growing. Then the bombings started. In 1919, a series of explosive attacks targeted government officials, judges, businessmen, and political figures across America. Newspapers filled with alarming headlines. Public anxiety intensified. Rumors spread. Politicians demanded action. The country entered a period that would become known as the Red Scare. And for a young government employee named J. Edgar Hoover, it was the opportunity of a lifetime. At the Department of Justice, Hoover was assigned to help investigate suspected radicals, anarchists, revolutionaries, political activists, anyone perceived as a potential threat to national security. The work suited him perfectly. Not because he enjoyed politics, because he enjoyed information. Names, addresses, associations, organizations, records. The more information collected, the clearer the picture became. At least in Hoover's mind. Soon, he began building extensive files. Thousands of names. Thousands of connections. Thousands of people categorized, documented, and monitored. To Hoover, this wasn't merely paperwork. It was intelligence. A map of potential threats. A way of bringing order to uncertainty. The more information he collected, the more valuable he became. Because while politicians gave speeches, Hoover had data. While others argued about dangers, Hoover had files. And in an age driven by fear, information was becoming one of the most valuable commodities in government. Then came the raids. Federal authorities launched a series of large-scale operations targeting suspected radicals throughout the country. Homes were searched. Organizations were infiltrated. Thousands were arrested. Many were detained with little evidence. Others were deported. Supporters argued the government was protecting the nation. Critics argued it was trampling civil liberties. The debate remains controversial more than a century later. But for Hoover, the raids accomplished something important. They elevated his reputation. He had proven himself useful, efficient, organized, reliable. Exactly the qualities government institutions value most. And unlike many public officials, Hoover wasn't seeking attention. At least not yet. He was building something far more durable. A reputation inside the system. The kind of reputation that opens doors. The kind that creates opportunities. The kind that survives political change. Because politicians come and go. Administrations come and go. But institutions remember. And institutions were beginning to notice J. Edgar Hoover. More importantly, Hoover was beginning to notice something about America. Fear creates demand. Demand for protection. Demand for security. Demand for information. The more frightened people become, the more willing they are to accept surveillance. Monitoring. Investigation. Control. It was a lesson he would carry with him for the rest of his life. And no one would apply that lesson more aggressively than J. Edgar Hoover. The Red Scare eventually faded. Public attention shifted. The headlines changed. But Hoover's career was only gaining momentum. Because the young man who spent his days organizing files was about to receive a much bigger opportunity. One that would allow him to build an institution in his own image. And once he got that opportunity, he never let go. The cabinet. Imagine walking into a government office. Against one wall stands a large filing cabinet. Then another. And another. And another. Drawer after drawer filled with names. Addresses. Organizations. Personal histories. Political beliefs. Connections. Most people see paper. J. Edgar Hoover sees power. Because every file answers a question. And every answer reduces uncertainty. The cabinet doesn't look dangerous. It doesn't carry a weapon. It doesn't make threats. Yet inside those drawers sits something more valuable than force. Knowledge. And Hoover was becoming addicted to collecting it. By the early 1920s, Hoover had established himself as one of the most capable young officials in Washington. He understood records, intelligence, investigation, and most importantly, bureaucracy. Now he was about to take control of an organization that desperately needed reform. An organization that would eventually become one of the most powerful law enforcement agencies in the world. The FBI? Chapter 3. Building the Bureau. In 1924, J. Edgar Hoover received the opportunity that would define his life. At just 29 years old, he was appointed director of the Bureau of Investigation, the organization that would eventually become the FBI. At the time, the Bureau was far from legendary. It was small, underfunded, politically damaged, and struggling to earn public trust. Corruption scandals had tarnished its reputation. Politicians questioned its effectiveness. Many Americans barely knew it existed. Hoover saw something different. Not what the Bureau was, what it could become. Because where others saw a troubled government agency, Hoover saw a blank canvas. An institution that could be rebuilt from the ground up. And rebuilt in his image. The transformation began immediately. Hoover demanded professionalism. Agents were expected to meet strict standards. Training improved. Hiring practices changed. Records became more organized. Investigations became more systematic. Everything had a process. Everything had a procedure. Everything had a place. For Hoover, efficiency wasn't merely desirable. It was essential. The Bureau became a machine. A machine powered by information. Every investigation generated reports. Every report generated records. Every record generated intelligence. And every piece of intelligence strengthened the institution. But Hoover wasn't focused only on improving investigations. He was building something larger. A reputation. Because public trust is a form of power. And Hoover understood that power needed to be cultivated. Carefully. Deliberately. Strategically. The Bureau began developing a new image. Professional. Modern. Scientific. Reliable. Agents wore suits. Followed procedures. Presented themselves as disciplined public servants. This was not accidental. It was branding. Long before most people used that word, Hoover understood something that Edward Bernays would have appreciated. People don't just respond to reality. They respond to perception. If Americans believed the Bureau was competent, its influence would grow. If Americans trusted the Bureau, its authority would grow. And if its authority grew, so would Hoover's. Meanwhile, technology was changing law enforcement. Fingerprint databases expanded. Identification systems improved. Records became more centralized. For the first time, information from across the country could be collected and organized on a national scale. To Hoover, it was revolutionary. A criminal arrested in one state could now be connected to crimes committed elsewhere. Patterns emerged. Connections appeared. Investigations became more sophisticated. The Bureau wasn't just catching criminals. It was building one of the largest information networks in America. And Hoover loved it. Because every new record strengthened the system. Every new file expanded the Bureau's reach. Every new database increased its value. The organization was becoming exactly what he envisioned. Disciplined. Efficient. Powerful. But something was still missing. The public. Most Americans still didn't pay much attention to the Bureau. That would soon change. Because the 1930s were about to produce a new kind of celebrity. The outlaw. Bank robbers. Kidnappers. Gangsters. Men whose crimes dominated newspaper headlines. And J. Edgar Hoover was about to turn their downfall into his greatest public relations campaign. The criminals would become famous. But the man hunting them would become even more famous. And once America learned his name, there would be no turning back. The checklist. Imagine starting your first day at a new job. You arrive a few minutes late. Nobody notices. You skip a small procedure. Nobody complains. You cut a few corners. Nothing happens. Now imagine working for J. Edgar Hoover. The late arrival is documented. The procedure matters. The corner cutting is unacceptable. Everything is measured. Everything is recorded. Everything is expected to meet the standard. To some people, it feels oppressive. To Hoover, it feels necessary. Because institutions don't become powerful by accident. They become powerful through systems. And Hoover trusted systems more than he trusted people. By the early 1930s, Hoover had transformed the Bureau of Investigation. The organization was stronger, more professional, more respected. But the greatest test was still ahead. Because America was entering one of the most turbulent decades in its history. The Great Depression. Banks were failing. Families were struggling. And across the country, a new generation of criminals was capturing the public imagination. For Hoover, it was both a threat and an opportunity. And he intended to make the most of it. Chapter 4. America's Top Cop. The Great Depression changed America. Banks collapsed. Businesses failed. Millions lost their jobs. Families struggled to survive. Confidence in institutions weakened. And during periods of uncertainty, something unusual often happens. Criminals become celebrities. Across the country, newspaper readers followed the exploits of notorious outlaws. Bank robbers. Kidnappers. Fugitives. Men who seemed to challenge authority itself. Names like John Dillinger. Pretty Boy Floyd. Babyface Nelson. Machine Gun Kelly. Their stories filled headlines. Their photographs appeared on front pages. Some Americans viewed them as dangerous criminals. Others viewed them as folk heroes. Rebels fighting a system many people no longer trusted. For J. Edgar Hoover, this was a problem. And an opportunity. Because every headline about a gangster was also a reminder that law enforcement appeared powerless. If criminals looked larger than life, the Bureau looked small. Hoover intended to change that. He understood something many government officials overlooked. Winning the battle wasn't enough. You also had to win the story. So while agents pursued criminals across the country, Hoover carefully cultivated a new public image. The Bureau became disciplined professionals. The criminals became threats to society. The narrative was clear: order versus chaos, law versus crime, civilization versus disorder. And Americans responded. As famous criminals were captured or killed, the Bureau's reputation grew. Every successful operation strengthened public confidence. Every newspaper story increased Hoover's visibility. Every victory expanded the organization's influence. The timing was perfect. Radio was becoming a powerful force. Newspapers reached millions. News traveled faster than ever before. And Hoover understood how to use media. Not unlike Edward Bernays. Though their goals were different. Bernays sold ideas. Hoover sold trust. Trust in law enforcement. Trust in institutions. Trust in the Bureau. The public began embracing a new image. The G-man. Government man. Professional. Fearless. Disciplined. The opposite of the reckless criminals he pursued. Movies celebrated them. Newspapers praised them. The FBI became a symbol. And symbols are powerful. Because symbols often matter more than facts. A successful arrest catches one criminal. A successful image campaign shapes millions of minds. Hoover achieved both. Soon, he wasn't merely directing a law enforcement agency. He was becoming a national figure. One of the most recognizable officials in America. People trusted him. Politicians respected him. Journalists sought his approval. And that popularity created something every powerful institution desires: independence. The more admired Hoover became, the harder he was to challenge. The harder he was to replace. The harder he was to control. Few people recognized the long-term implications. At the time, most Americans simply saw results. Crime was being fought. Criminals were being captured. The Bureau appeared effective. But beneath the success, another process was unfolding. The Bureau's records were growing. Its intelligence networks were expanding. Its influence was increasing. And so was Hoover's. The famous gangsters eventually disappeared. Some were arrested. Some were killed. Some faded into history. But Hoover remained. And with every passing year, his position became stronger. More secure. More permanent. The outlaws were temporary. The institution was forever. Or at least that was the goal. Because while America celebrated the FBI's victories against criminals, Hoover was already turning his attention elsewhere. Toward a different kind of threat. One that couldn't be captured in a bank robbery. Or stopped with handcuffs. A threat hidden inside politics. Inside activism. Inside society itself. And fighting that threat would require something Hoover valued even more than arrests: information. The headline. Imagine waking up in 1934. You unfold the morning newspaper. Across the front page is a photograph. A famous outlaw is dead. Federal agents are being praised. The Bureau is being celebrated. The story feels simple. Good versus evil. Law versus crime. The public loves stories like that. Most people do. But behind the headline sits another story. A quieter story. A story about image. About perception. About who controls the narrative. Because while America was reading about gangsters, Edgar Hoover was becoming something far more powerful. A brand. By the late 1930s, Hoover had achieved something extraordinary. He had transformed the FBI into one of the most respected institutions in America. The public trusted it. Politicians relied on it. The media admired it. But public trust creates opportunities. And opportunities create temptations. Because once people trust you with information, they often give you more of it. And Edgar Hoover was about to collect more information than anyone imagined. Chapter 5. The Secret Files. By the late 1930s, J. Edgar Hoover had become one of the most influential officials in America. The FBI's reputation was soaring. The public admired it. Politicians praised it. Journalists treated Hoover like a national authority. From the outside, everything appeared straightforward. A respected law enforcement leader protecting the country. But behind the scenes, another system was growing. Quietly. Relentlessly. A system built on information. Because Hoover never stopped collecting it. Names. Associations. Conversations. Political beliefs. Personal histories. Potential weaknesses. Anything that might someday matter. At first, the practice seemed reasonable. Intelligence agencies gather information. Law enforcement agencies maintain records. Governments monitor threats. That wasn't unusual. What made Hoover unusual was the scale. And the secrecy. Over time, the FBI accumulated enormous amounts of information on public figures. Politicians. Activists. Journalists. Labor leaders. Civil rights organizers. Government officials. People suspected of criminal activity. People suspected of political extremism. And sometimes people who simply attracted Hoover's attention. The files kept growing. Drawer after drawer. Cabinet after cabinet. Year after year. To Hoover, information was security. The more he knew, the better prepared he felt. The more uncertainty he could eliminate. The more control he could maintain. But critics saw something else. Power. A dangerous amount of power. Because information changes relationships. Especially when only one side possesses it. Imagine entering a meeting knowing everything about the other person. Their mistakes. Their secrets. Their fears. Their ambitions. And imagine they know almost nothing about you. That imbalance creates leverage. Whether you use it or not. Whether you intend to or not. The leverage exists. And according to many historians, Hoover understood that perfectly. Stories began circulating throughout Washington. Stories about secret files. Private information. Sensitive records. Material that could embarrass powerful people. Sometimes ruin them. The rumors became part of Hoover's legend. Some were true. Some were exaggerated. Some may never be fully verified. But the effect was undeniable. People believed Hoover knew things. Important things. Dangerous things. And belief alone can be powerful. Because fear doesn't require certainty. Only possibility. Presidents learned this. Members of Congress learned this. Political rivals learned this. No one wanted to become the subject of an FBI file. No one wanted unnecessary attention. And no one wanted conflict with Hoover. Over time, that reputation became one of his greatest assets. Not a weapon that needed to be fired. A weapon that only needed to exist. The possibility was often enough. The irony was remarkable. The man who spent decades fighting criminals had discovered a form of power that didn't require violence. It didn't require arrests. It didn't require force. Only information. Information collected. Information stored. Information protected. And occasionally, information revealed. Carefully. Strategically. At exactly the right moment. As the years passed, Hoover's influence expanded far beyond law enforcement. Because politicians come and go. Administrations rise and fall. But information accumulates. And Hoover was accumulating more than anyone else. The question was no longer whether he had power. The question was whether anyone could challenge it. And soon, America would face a crisis that would make Hoover even more powerful than before. A global war. A new enemy. And a new reason for Americans to accept surveillance in the name of security. The drawer. Imagine sitting at a desk. In front of you is a locked drawer. Inside are documents. Nothing dramatic. No weapons. No stacks of cash. Just paper. Names. Reports. Conversations. Photographs. The drawer seems harmless. Until you realize what's written inside. A senator's private life. A journalist's hidden source. A business leader's secret dealings. An activist's personal history. Suddenly, the drawer feels heavier. Not because of its contents. Because of what those contents represent. Knowledge. And knowledge has a peculiar quality. The person who possesses it gains power over the people who do not. Few people understood that better than J. Edgar Hoover. The Second World War would transform governments around the globe. National security became the highest priority. Fear returned. Suspicion returned. And demands for intelligence exploded. For Hoover, it was the perfect environment. Because every crisis creates a simple question. Who can keep us safe? And J. Edgar Hoover already had an answer. The FBI? Chapter 6. The Enemies List. Wars change governments. They change priorities. They change what people are willing to tolerate. And perhaps most importantly, they change the balance between freedom and security. During World War II and the decades that followed, Americans became increasingly concerned about threats. Foreign threats. Domestic threats. Communist threats. Hidden threats. The world felt dangerous. Uncertain. Unpredictable. For J. Edgar Hoover, these fears confirmed something he had believed for years. Vigilance was essential. Information was essential. Surveillance was essential. At least in his view. The problem was that once surveillance expands, defining the target becomes more complicated. At first, the focus seemed obvious. Foreign agents. Espionage networks. National security risks. But over time, the list grew. Political activists. Protest movements. Labor organizers. Civil rights leaders. Student groups. Organizations that challenged the status quo. People Hoover believed could destabilize society. Or threaten America. Or simply create disorder. The distinction was not always clear. And that ambiguity would become one of the most controversial aspects of his career. Because Hoover saw threats where others saw dissent. He saw danger where others saw activism. He saw potential instability where others saw democratic participation. To his supporters, he was protecting the nation. To his critics, he was protecting the existing power structure. The debate continues to this day. No example illustrates that conflict more clearly than Martin Luther King Jr. Today, King is remembered as one of the most important figures in American history. A symbol of civil rights, nonviolent resistance, and social progress. Hoover saw something different. He viewed King and the broader civil rights movement with deep suspicion. The FBI monitored King extensively. Wiretaps were authorized. Communications were intercepted. Reports were compiled. Investigations expanded. The surveillance became increasingly aggressive. And increasingly difficult to justify. Critics later argued that Hoover had crossed a line. A line between protecting national security and targeting political opponents. A line between investigation and intimidation. A line between law enforcement and control. The controversy wasn't limited to King. Throughout the 1950s and 1960s, the FBI launched numerous operations aimed at monitoring and disrupting organizations it considered dangerous. Some of those organizations advocated violence. Others did not. Some genuinely posed risks. Others simply challenged existing institutions. The most famous of these efforts became known as COINTELPRO, short for Counterintelligence Program. The name sounded bureaucratic, almost harmless. The reality was far more controversial. The program involved surveillance, infiltration, disruption, psychological tactics. Efforts designed not merely to observe organizations, but to weaken them, divide them, neutralize them. Supporters argued extraordinary measures were necessary. Critics argued democratic governments should never operate that way. The ethical questions were enormous. and many remain unresolved. Because Hoover's methods produced results. That was always the problem. The methods worked. Information was gathered. Organizations were monitored. Potential threats were identified. But effectiveness alone does not answer the question of legitimacy. Something can be effective and still be dangerous. Something can produce results and still undermine the values it claims to protect. This was the paradox at the center of Hoover's career. The more successful he became, the more power he accumulated. The more power he accumulated, the harder it became to question him. And the harder it became to distinguish where security ended and control began. By now, Hoover's influence extended far beyond criminal investigations. He was shaping political realities, social realities, national conversations. Not through elections, not through speeches, but through information. And information, when concentrated in the hands of a single institution, can become something very close to power itself. The telephone. Imagine sitting at home late at night. The conversation is private. Or so you believe. You speak freely. Share opinions. Discuss concerns. Say things you would never announce publicly. Then, for a moment, a thought enters your mind. What if someone is listening? The thought is enough to change the conversation. You choose different words. Avoid certain topics. Leave some things unsaid. Nothing has happened. No one has interrupted. No one has made a threat. Yet your behavior has already changed. That is the strange power of surveillance. Sometimes it doesn't need to be used. People only need to believe it might be. And few people understood that better than Hoover. By the 1960s, Hoover had become one of the most powerful unelected figures in America. Presidents came and went. Administrations changed. Political movements rose and fell. Hoover remained. The files remained. The institution remained. And increasingly, people began asking a difficult question. If J. Edgar Hoover possessed so much power, who exactly had power over him? Chapter 7. Too powerful to fire. Power usually has an expiration date. Presidents serve terms. Senators face elections. Corporate leaders retire. Military commanders are replaced. Most positions come with limits. J. Edgar Hoover seemed to operate under different rules. By the 1950s, he had become something almost unheard of in American government. An unelected official whose influence stretched across multiple administrations. Presidents came and went. Hoover remained. When Franklin Roosevelt entered the White House, Hoover was already running the FBI. When Roosevelt died, Hoover remained. Harry Truman arrived. Hoover remained. Dwight Eisenhower arrived. Hoover remained. John F. Kennedy arrived. Hoover remained. Lyndon Johnson arrived. Hoover remained. The pattern became impossible to ignore. Political power changed hands repeatedly. Institutional power stayed exactly where it was. Inside Hoover's office. This longevity created something extraordinary. Experience. Connections. Knowledge. And perhaps most importantly, leverage. Because every year Hoover stayed in power, his collection of information grew larger. More files. More records. More intelligence. More secrets. Not only about criminals. About politicians. Government officials. Public figures. People capable of influencing the country. People capable of influencing him. The relationship was becoming complicated. Presidents technically outranked Hoover. They could issue orders. Set policies. Direct government priorities. Yet many historians have noted a strange reality. Few presidents seemed eager to challenge him. Some respected him. Some admired him. Some may have feared the political consequences of confronting him. Others may have feared something else. What Hoover knew, whether those fears were justified, remains debated. But the perception mattered. And perception often creates its own reality. Stories circulated constantly throughout Washington. Stories about files. About sensitive information. About embarrassing secrets. About political leverage. Many of those stories were impossible to verify. Some were exaggerated. Some were likely true. Together, they created a powerful legend. And legends influence behavior. Even among powerful people. Imagine becoming President of the United States. You occupy the most powerful office in the country. Millions of people know your name. The military answers to you. Federal agencies answer to you. Then you enter a meeting with a man who has spent decades collecting information on everyone around you. A man who knows Washington better than you do. A man who has survived every administration before yours. The dynamic changes. Whether spoken or unspoken. Whether acknowledged or ignored. The dynamic changes. Hoover understood institutions. He understood bureaucracy. And he understood something many politicians never fully grasped. Power is not always visible. Sometimes the most powerful person in the room is not the one sitting at the head of the table. Sometimes it is the person who knows the most. As the 1960s progressed, criticism of Hoover became louder. Journalists began asking difficult questions. Civil rights leaders challenged FBI practices. Political activists accused the Bureau of overreach. Some members of government privately wondered whether Hoover had accumulated too much influence. But wondering and acting are two different things. Removing Hoover was easier to discuss than to accomplish. Because by now, he wasn't merely leading an agency. He had become part of the political landscape itself. A permanent feature of Washington. Like the Capitol building. Like the White House. Like the institutions surrounding them. People had difficulty imagining the government without him. And that may have been his greatest achievement. Or his greatest danger. Depending on your perspective. Because democracies are designed around accountability. Rotation. Limits on power. Yet Hoover had effectively built a position that seemed immune to all three. For nearly half a century. The result was unprecedented. One man. One office. Decades of accumulated information. And remarkably few checks on either. If there was a lesson hidden inside Hoover's rise, it was a simple one. Power grows strongest when it becomes familiar. When people stop questioning it. When permanence begins to feel normal. And by the end of the 1960s, Hoover's power felt very normal indeed. But permanence is an illusion. Eventually, every career ends. Every institution changes. Every powerful figure faces the same reality. Time. And time was finally catching up with J. Edgar Hoover. The President. Imagine standing in the Oval Office on your first day as president. The responsibility is overwhelming. The expectations are enormous. Every decision matters. Every mistake matters. Then someone hands you a briefing. Inside are the names of key officials you'll be working with. Most are new. Most arrived with your administration. One name stands out. J. Edgar Hoover. He served your predecessor. And the predecessor before that. And the predecessor before that. Suddenly, a strange thought enters your mind. You may be president. But he was here first. And if history is any guide, he may still be here after you're gone. For decades, Hoover had built an empire of information. The FBI expanded. The files expanded. The legend expanded. And so did the belief that his power would never truly end. Then, in 1972, something happened that many Americans had never experienced. J. Edgar Hoover was gone. And almost immediately, a new question emerged. What exactly had he left behind? Chapter 8. The Man Who Knew Too Much. On May 2, 1972, J. Edgar Hoover died. He was 77 years old. And for the first time in nearly half a century, the FBI would exist without him. The news spread quickly. Newspapers rushed to print special editions. Television networks interrupted programming. Politicians issued statements. Public figures offered tributes. For many Americans, it felt like the end of an era. Because it was. Hoover had led the Bureau for 48 years. An almost unimaginable length of time. Entire careers had begun and ended while he remained in office. Generations of politicians had risen and fallen. Hoover had outlasted them all. Now he was gone. But almost immediately, attention shifted away from the man himself. Toward the thing he left behind. The files. For decades, rumors had circulated throughout Washington. Stories about secret records. Private dossiers. Sensitive information. Material collected on politicians, celebrities, activists, and public figures. Many Americans assumed those stories would remain rumors forever. Then Hoover died. And suddenly, people wanted answers. What exactly had he been collecting? How much information existed? Who was included? What had been done with it? The questions came faster than the answers. Because Hoover's information system had become so vast that even government officials struggled to understand its full scope. Some files were official. Others were personal. Some were maintained through normal FBI procedures. Others existed in a gray area that remains controversial even today. The deeper investigators looked, the more complicated the picture became. Stories emerged about confidential records. Unauthorized collections of information. Sensitive material kept outside standard channels. Evidence that Hoover had accumulated far more than criminal intelligence. He had accumulated influence. Stored in filing cabinets. Locked away for decades. The revelations shocked many Americans. Not because they proved every rumor. They didn't. But because they confirmed enough of them. Enough to raise serious questions. Questions about accountability. Oversight. And the dangers of concentrated power. The response was swift. Government officials began introducing reforms. Changes designed to prevent another Hoover. Limits were discussed. Procedures were rewritten. Oversight increased. Most notably, future FBI directors would eventually face term limits. A simple idea. One person should not control an institution indefinitely. No matter how effective they appear. No matter how respected they become. No matter how much information they possess. The lesson seemed obvious in hindsight. But hindsight has an advantage. It arrives after the consequences. For decades, Hoover had operated in an environment where his power grew steadily. Few people challenged it. Fewer still succeeded. Only after his death did many Americans fully appreciate how unusual his position had become. And how dangerous it might have been. Yet even as criticism grew, another reality remained difficult to ignore. Hoover had transformed the FBI. He had modernized investigations. Expanded forensic science. Professionalized federal law enforcement. Built systems that remain influential today. His legacy was impossible to dismiss. The problem was that it was equally impossible to simplify. Heroes leave clean stories. Villains often do too. Hoover left something messy. A legacy filled with achievements and abuses. Protection and overreach. Security and surveillance. Success and controversy. The same actions that earned him praise from some Americans earned him condemnation from others. And that ambiguity only grew after his death. Because once the man was gone, the myth took over. Supporters remembered the crime fighter. The institution builder. The patriot. Critics remembered the surveillance. The secret files. The concentration of power. Both versions contained truth. Neither told the entire story. And perhaps that is why Hoover remains such a fascinating figure. The farther history moves away from him, the harder he becomes to define. Not because the facts disappeared. Because there are so many of them. And they point in different directions. The office. Imagine entering an office that has not changed in decades. The desk remains exactly where it always was. The cabinets remain locked. The papers remain stacked. The photographs remain hanging on the walls. For years, this room belonged to one of the most powerful men in America. Now it sits empty. The silence feels strange. Because the power is gone. Yet traces of it remain everywhere. In the records. In the routines. In the institution itself. The man has left the room. But the system he built is still standing. And systems often survive much longer than the people who create them. Most powerful figures leave behind wealth. Or monuments. Or political movements. J. Edgar Hoover left behind something less visible. An institution. A culture. A blueprint for how information could be collected, organized, and used. Which raises the final question. Was Hoover a patriot who protected America? A bureaucrat who accumulated too much power? Or something in between? That question remains surprisingly difficult to answer. And it is where our story ends.